Well, it is time now to take a look at what's grabbing headlines in the press. Solange Mougin is here in studio to do just that. Solange, firstly, the re-election of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. It's all eyes on Ankara. It's been praised in the domestic media.
Yeah, President Erdogan won by some 52% because, and this is the view of the Turkish paper Triet, he won because Turkey prefers growth and stability, and because, in this paper's view, Turks wanted to, quote, unravel the dirty plans of the West. Now, for the English language Turkish paper Daily Sabah, its editorialist writes that this election marks, quote, the smack of firm people, of their showing how determined they are, quote, not to descend into internal political turmoil, but to ensure instead that Erdogan continues.
And Solange, how is the foreign press covering the re-election of Erdogan?
Well, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung explains that in Germany, which has a large expat Turkish community, that 2 out of 3 voters, Turkish voters overseas, they voted for Erdogan. That's largely due, the paper says, to many of the immigrants being from the heart of Anatolia, where Erdogan has strong support, but also, it says, because young Turks have liked and bought into Erdogan's nationalist stances. But beyond this article, there is much disappointment in the foreign papers. The Economist, it laments that this was the best chance in a decade to repair Turkey's democracy. It calls it a loss. For The Guardian, it says that the West is now caught between fear and hope, fear that Turkey could take NATO further towards Russia, and hope now that Erdogan has has been re-elected to his final term, that he might, quote, be open to persuasion and base his foreign policy on something other than self-preservation, end quote, self-preservation catering, it says, to the nationalist electorate.
From election news to environmental news, Solange, today in Paris, the second round of negotiations for the Global Plastics Treaty begins. What's that all about?
Yeah, it begins here in Paris today, and all throughout the weekend, the press has been covering this. 175 nations are trying to create a binding treaty to curb plastics. The treaty is hoped to be signed next year. As we see on Libération's front page of its weekend edition, it's a Saturday, Sunday, Monday edition because it's a holiday today. The war has begun, it says. Libération headlines that, quote, this environmental and health nightmare is upon us. And it adds, though, that in this war, the plastics industry and petrol industry is fighting tooth and nail against pushes to curb plastic use by lobbying instead for recycling programs, which leads Libération to ask in its 2-page spread if these talks, are they a sham? The Hill, too, the American site, it's also publishing an article on this. It says that it has a scathing review in its walk-up to coverage. It's in this opinion piece, it says that the UN environmental program has laid incredibly low ambitions to reduce plastic pollutions, and instead has opted for the industry-backed recycling solutions that they themselves, the Hill writes, are toxic and exacerbate environmental and health catastrophes. Now, The Guardian explains to us that proof of those catastrophes is already upon us. It says that it's focusing on research that's found that recycled plastic is actually leaching hundreds of toxic chemicals into our food by simply being in contact with them. And if we're not eating it, well, then it is falling on our heads and in the air we breathe. Science Alert tells us of this what is called a plastics forecast. It's a weather forecast that looks at the amount of plastic in the air, and it says, and is doing so for Paris for the duration of the 5 days of talks. And the report shows that between 40 and 48 kilos of plastic will blanket the Paris region, the greater Paris region, for every 24 hours. And that those 48 kilos of plastic, if there's a heavy rain, could be multiplied by 10. So that's some 480 kilos per day.
Solange, you're staying here in France for our next story. You're covering the Cannes Film Festival. It, of course, wrapped up on Saturday, but reactions are still making headlines here in France.
Yeah, as Variety puts it, it's the fiery political speech by Juliette Triet that is making headlines. The winner of the Palme d'Or has created, it explains, an uproar in France with divergent views of whether or not the ceremony was the right forum to denounce, quote, the neoliberal government that's commodified culture, broken down the French model of cultural exception, as well as she said in her speech, suppressed in a shocking manner protests against pension reforms. Now, Le Monde, it's covering this. It says that the culture minister has responded via Twitter saying she was estomaquée or stunned by what she says it was an unjust speech. Since then, as Le Monde tells us, the left has praised Triet for her courage during the speech. For me, as we see in Mediapart, it says that the government's reaction to her speech has been, you want to get financed, as her film Anatomy of a Fall was financed in part by the government, then keep your mouth shut. It says that these are threats to free speech and culture, and a real threat, it says, to an essential balance of powers. From the right, though, there are divergent views. As we see in Le Figaro, it says that Justine broke the magic. It says this in its editorial. Le Figaro argues that she has, quote, brought back the old demons of the cultural left. Needless to say, Cannes' final day was a very political one.
Finally, Solange, you're leaving us with an article about a bear with a sweet tooth.
Yeah, taking out the trash. You may think about this next time you take out the trash. USA Today tells us the story of a very hungry black bear in Connecticut that scared bakery workers who were taking out the trash of uneaten sweets. The black bear scared the employee. She backed away, and instead the bear gobbled up some 60 cupcakes before moving on.